increases in revenue are typically dropping directly to the bottom line, directly to the NOI. So it's really important that you get your projected rents correctly. And if you're an LP, you need to make sure that the GP is projecting their rents correctly. Welcome to the Multifamily Wealth Podcast. I'm your host, Axel Ragnarsson, and on this show, I dissect how seasoned multifamily investors started, built, and scaled their businesses. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another quick solo episode here on the Multifamily Wealth Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about the three big assumptions in multifamily underwriting. And when I say the big three assumptions, I mean the three assumptions that most significantly drive how we calculate projected returns and affect projected returns. Now, these are the three assumptions that if an investor gets them wrong and they're a little bit too aggressive in their assumptions, significantly increases the likelihood that the deal is going to have problems. And then inversely, if an investor projects very conservative assumptions here, it really increases the likelihood the project's going to go well. If you're an LP, these are the three assumptions you should be looking for when you're actually looking at a sponsor's underwriting. If you're a sponsor yourself, these are the three assumptions that you have to get right in order to just protect your investment as it relates to getting into a deal and not just being too aggressive with how you actually just underwrite the deal and project income, expenses, exit value, etc. So long story short, we're going to dive into them. I'm going to share a quick little mathematical example where I compare a base case with two different versions of that specific assumption in the underwriting and talk about how it affects the projected returns. At the end, I'm going to use one where I slightly blend all three. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of investors do, is they get a little bit aggressive with each of these three, and next thing you know, they turn a bad deal into a good deal on paper. And it's very easy to do so. It doesn't really require that much in terms of how significantly you change these for a deal to go from being to being, oh, it looks pretty good. So the first thing is rent growth throughout the hold period. And when I say rent growth throughout the hold period, I mean year over year growth in the average rents at the property that you're buying. And the reason that this is such a significant assumption is that it compounds over the life of the hold, right? Let's say you're going from 2% to 4% rent growth, only a 2% difference, right? But that's a 100% difference in the actual growth assumption. And then when you extrapolate that over a 5-year or a 7-year, or even worst case would be 7 or 10-year hold, a long hold period where it's really giving itself a chance to compound over that period of time. But even over a 5-year hold, it has drastic impacts on the actual projected cash on cash return and IRR of a deal. So let's use a quick little example here. All the other variables for all of these examples are going to be the same in terms of, I'm going to use this same hypothetical deal for the next, for this assumption, the rent growth assumption, as well as the next two that I'll talk about in a moment. Same purchase price, same debt, same everything. It's all the same. I'm just changing this one assumption. So we're going from 2% rent growth over a 5-year hold to 3.5% rent growth. This is something that so many investors did in terms of increasing this number just a little bit to make deals work in 2020, 21, 22. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people are doing it now, but it's a marginal change to go from 2% annual rent growth to 3.5%, or at least marginal in terms of how investors oftentimes think of it, especially newer investors. So base case, 2% rent growth. The sample deal we're talking about here is 8.98% projected cash on cash returns, just under 9%, and a 10.15% IRR. So again, 8.98 for cash on cash, 10.15 for IRR. When we go from 2% to 3.5% rent growth over a 5-year hold, cash on cash return goes from 8.98 to 9.15. But more significantly, the IRR goes from 10.15% to 13.5%. So it goes up over 3.25%. A deal that's a 13.5% IRR, if you're in like a Class B market and you're in a decent market buying a Class B property, that's right on the verge of being something that's compelling. Whereas just over 10 is not that compelling, right? So this one little change is turning a deal that you'd probably pass on into something that you're probably going to convince yourself to explore further. Now, big assumption number 2 is the exit cap rate. And fundamentally, when you manipulate the exit cap rate in a commercial real estate deal, is you're manipulating the exit price. And obviously, the exit price is incredibly important because it's dictating the terminal value of the property, and that has a significant impact of all the equity that's being returned to the investors, right? So we need to get that one right. Again, we have this base deal, 8.98% cash on cash, 10.15% projected cash on cash return. Those numbers are calculated using a 7% exit cap rate. Now, if we move that down to a 6.25 exit cap rate, it's not going to change the cash on cash return because terminal value isn't going to affect that. But the IRR goes from a 10.15 to a 12.52. Again, that small change adds another 2.5% and basically increases the IRR by over 25%, right? That's a significant change. And again, it's probably going to convince you to take a deeper look at this. So again, some people listening, a lot of the active operators are like, yeah, well, a 7% exit cap rate to a 6.25 is a significant change. And that is a significant change. But a lot of LPs don't really know the difference, So if you're an LP, you need to understand the market cap rate in the market that you're participating in. And it's even more impactful if we have a 75 basis point difference in a lower cap rate market. If we're going from a 5.75 down to a 5, for example, as the exit cap, well, that's going to have an even more significant impact because a 10 basis point difference going from, call it 4% to 4.1%, has a significantly larger value on the terminal value of an asset than going from 7 to 7.1, 7.1, right? The lower the cap rate is, the higher the multiple on the NOI in terms of how we're calculating the exit value, and the more a small difference in that exit cap, the difference it has on the actual terminal value. So the second important assumption here is exit cap rate, stabilized cap rate. Projection number 3. Or assumption number 3, I should say, are the projected rents post-renovation for the units within the community that you're buying. Revenue is so critical in multifamily operations and multifamily underwriting, just in multifamily real estate. And I talked about this on a lot of podcast episodes, but I always like to return to it and really hammer this home. Your revenue fundamentally dictates the entirety of your NOI. And that's because the vast majority of expenses are fixed in multifamily real estate. Your expenses, your property taxes are fixed. Your insurance is fixed. Your contract services are likely fixed. Your utilities are more or less fixed. You might have slightly higher, for example, water usage if you're paying water when you have more units occupied than not. But oftentimes, for example, if you're in the Northeast, that's offset by the fact that when you have vacant apartments, you're paying heat, for example, in the winter. And then nationwide, you're paying electric if you have a vacant apartment versus the tenant paying, assuming that they're separately metered. So basically all of the expenses are fixed, right? The variables are probably going to be repairs and maintenance. You're going to have slightly higher R&M expense when you have occupied units than vacant units. And you're going to have slightly higher, management costs typically if you're paying a gross percentage of your revenue for management. When your building is more occupied, you're collecting more rent. But I say all of that to say that increases in revenue are typically dropping directly to the bottom line, directly to the NOI. So it's really important that you get your projected rents correctly. And if you're an LP, you need to make sure that the GP is projecting their rents correctly. So for example, the base case deal that we've been talking about, those projected rents came in at an average of $1,882 per unit. And this is a deal that we actually underwrote. So post-renovation, once we do our value add, where are we going to be leasing our units? Well, the average rent for our renovated units at stabilization in our base case here is $1,882. Now, let's say I increase that by roughly 10%. And I think I can get 2,095, right? Average rents, I move them to 2,095. Again, that's not a massive increase. It's a little bit more than 10%. But again, if a lot of investors want to get aggressive and they think they're going to set the new rent comp in the area, that's probably reasonable. So let's say I think I can get 2,095. So that's going to take our cash on cash from 8.98 and our IRR from 10.15 to a cash on cash return of 9.15. And again, more relevant here is the IRR. It's going to take it to 13.23. So we're going from 10.5 to 13.23. Almost a 3.75, or excuse me, a 2.75% difference. And people listening to this, I know your eyes might be glossing over the fact that I'm talking numbers, but again, it's an easy change to make. Well, we're going to do a slightly nicer renovation than the comps that I use. So I think we're going to be able to get another $100, get another 5%. And that's how you turn a deal that you'd probably pass on into a deal that you're probably pursuing further. So again, to recap the big three assumptions here, we have rent growth over the hold period, we have the exit cap rate, and we have the projected rents of the units that we're buying. Any individual change is probably not going to put you in a really compromised position, right? In terms of if you're getting aggressive with one out of these three. What a lot of investors do is they start to tweak one, two, or all three, right? And next thing you know, when you tweak all three, compounds the difference in the underwriting quite significantly. So let me share an example that blends all three in terms of now we're getting a little bit more aggressive with our assumptions with all three of these. Let's say we're bringing our average rents to 2036. So not the full 2095 I talked about. So let's say we're, about 7-8% difference. We're going to bring them up to 2036 instead of 1882. We think we're going to be right at the comps or something like that, right? Instead of giving ourselves a margin of safety. We're going to increase our rent growth from 2% to 3%. So again, not the full 3.5 I used in the earlier example. And we're going to bring our exit cap rate from 7 to 6.6. So again, not all the way down to the 6.25, but we're just going to bring it down a little bit. I think 6.6 is a fine exit cap rate. These are three smaller changes in the grand scheme, smaller than the individual examples I used. And again, to recap, we're going to bring our rents from 1882 to 2036. Our rent growth over the hold, 5-year hold period is what I'm talking about here, 2% to 3%, exit cap rate from 7 to 6.6. This is something that a lot of investors find themselves doing. That's going to bring your cash on cash return from that 8.98. It's going to take it all the way to 10.22%. It's going to take your IRR from 9.15 all the way up to 14.72. And now we've turned a deal that we would have passed on into a deal that we're probably going to pursue. That's where things can get dangerous, is where you start to flex on your underwriting criteria within multiple different components here. You throw in a slight little tweak to your expense assumptions and a quick little tweak to your debt, and next thing you know, you're up at a 15, 16, 17 IRR and you're doing the deal. So, again, and to recap here, and I want to make sure this goes without being said, there's obviously all kinds of different components of the underwriting that matter. And if I were to create, those are the big three that I always like to look at. If I were to create kind of an honorable mentions list, it would be your debt assumptions, how much leverage you're using. It would be your CapEx budget, which is oftentimes funded out of equity, or a percentage of that's funded out of equity. If you're securing debt to finance your CapEx, projecting 15,000 a unit versus 20,000 units is going to have drastic impacts. And then obviously it's going to be your actual operating expenses, because that also impacts your NOI. But I think the big three that are regularly manipulated are rent growth, exit cap, and projected rents. With your expenses, yeah, you can manipulate those, but you're still going to have your taxes. You're still going to have your insurance. You're still going to have something for repairs and maintenance. You're probably going to have your contract services. It's a little harder to manipulate those because those are typically a little bit more agreed upon in terms of the underwriting as it relates to just an operator actually looking at what it's going to cost to run a deal. Only area you can really get that aggressive in there is your contract services and your repairs and maintenance. If you're at $750 a unit, but it's really $1,750 a unit, it's going to have an impact, but it's not going to be as impactful as getting more aggressive with your rent assumptions, just speaking broadly. So long story short, these are the big three you got to get right. If you're an LP and you're underwriting a deal that you potentially are going to passively invest in, take a look at these, make sure that you understand these through and through, make sure the operator or the sponsor can speak to them at an eloquent level and has reasoning behind why they're making the different assumptions that they are. And lastly, if you found this episode to be insightful or helpful, please consider leaving the podcast a rating and review. If you think somebody in your network would find value in this episode, please consider sending it to them, whether that's texting it to them, emailing it to them, or if you really want to be my hero, throwing it on social media and pushing traffic to it. Helps the podcast get noticed by more folks. And obviously that's our objective, is to keep growing this and continue helping multifamily investors, both new and experienced. But thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you guys on the next episode.